Hi everybody, thanks so much for coming. My name is Sue Kientz and I'm going to show you the latest images from Pluto that we just got back from the New Horizons spacecraft that flew by last week on the 14th. And we're going to enjoy what, in fact, some of them just came down today, that they were just released to the public today. And after that, we're going to look at some other large objects, one that is as big as Pluto and some that are almost as big as Pluto, that are in the same area of our solar system. And they are going to be the new objects that astrology is going to be able to include in horoscopes. But it's just very early days and we're only just starting to learn about them, but I'm going to show you what they seem to be meaning by relating them to people who have them in their charts. And I'm going to show you how we're going to look at that. But first of all, we're going to look at Pluto, and that's what we're going to move to those pictures. Oh, I have to turn off the button. Okay. One second. All right, first I wanted to show you what we've been seeing of Pluto, and then we'll look at the recent pictures. But this comparison image was really interesting. Someone put out on the internet, I think it was Science Magazine website, where in 1996, this was the best picture that we had of Pluto. And this is from space telescopes. We just could not focus in on this large body. And so that's it. You could see there's something on the surface, but there's no way that we could tell any detail, and that's where we've been. But at that point, we knew that it would probably be a good idea if we would go out on in a spacecraft mission. And so in 2005, 1 year before New Horizons launched, this is the best picture we've got of the system. You see, it looks like a double star system, and what that is Pluto has a very large moon, and when it's shining like that from the sun's reflection, you can see how close its moon Charon is, and it has a couple of little moons as well. It has 5 moons total. And now, since we finally arrived at Pluto, NASA's spacecraft flew by. And this is the detail we got, and we'll show it as an even bigger picture of the face of Pluto, which we're very surprised to see that it's reddish, and it's just so many details. This is the face that we saw as we flew by, because we only had one shot, which we're not going into orbit. So this was incredibly surprising in the sense that we almost had this huge heart as this region on the bottom of the planet, and it was then quickly determined that the discoverer, Clyde Tombaugh, who was an American living in Arizona, would be named after him. So it's the Tombaugh Regio, or Tombaugh region. And so also there were so many different dark spots and grooves and pits and everything. Everybody was very excited. Not only the scientists at NASA, but the Twitter universe just exploded with people just so delighted to see these pictures. Now, after like a day, they started to download a lot of the higher resolution pictures. It will take 16 months to get all the pictures back, because it's a very slow process of getting very big images back. It's a very, like a modem, modem speed. But as they're seeing these pictures, what they were really remarking at is there were very few craters that were in evidence on Pluto's surface. And this means that there's some kind of recent, and when we say recent, we mean within the last 100 million years, tectonic work like volcanism, like overflow of magma, or just tectonic movement that would erase craters that would have been put there, like the craters. We have craters on the moon. There was a big bombardment in our solar system way back in the early days, and the moons retain that because it's geologically dead. Well, Pluto has not been very long inactive, and it might even have some of these forces. We just haven't seen them absolutely in evidence. But it's very remarkable to see hardly any craters. What we do see are little ice mountains. And so those are those things that are poking out, and they're like 11,000 feet tall, in case you were curious as to how tall these things are. Here's the large moon that I was talking about earlier, Charon. Charon is really interesting. It's got more craters, as you can see in the breakout picture there. It's got this very dark spot at the top, which is a remarkable thing. They're not sure whether it's a depression or it's a plateau. So more images will probably help them decide on that. And that material on the top, it might be some kind of thing that's ejecting from Pluto and settling on Charon. So that might be one piece of evidence that there is some ejected coming out of a geologically active planet, Pluto. But I noted here in the slide that Charon is so big, it's like about almost a third, or a little bit maybe more than a third, the size of Pluto. And they were thinking about actually considering it to be a moon, a planet in itself, and making Pluto a double planet system. But unfortunately, they decided on another definition of planet, which is what made Pluto a dwarf planet in 2006, and I don't know if you heard all the hoopla about that, where it was demoted and it's no longer a planet. So it was just they were trying to classify the planets a little better, but it seemed to be an insult, and a lot of astrologers have been upset about it, and school children and everything. But I think it would have been really more interesting if they had made Pluto a double planet. I think people would have been excited more, and that would have helped kids especially be more excited about astronomy. Here is an actual picture without moving them together of Pluto on the right and Charon on the left.
Wow.
So this was from several million miles away as we were going towards Pluto, as the spacecraft was on its way. But you can see that it's very, very close. In fact, it's almost 20 times, Charon is 20 times closer to Pluto than our moon is to the Earth. So our moon is bigger than Pluto, so if our moon was a lot closer, can you imagine how big that moon would be? So standing on Pluto and seeing Charon is probably a pretty spectacular sight in the sky. Here is just to show you the size comparison. Now this is a false color image. This isn't really the colors.
I was going to ask.
And they do that because they want to show a lot of detail that will come out if they use different filters, color filters. But this also gives you a better idea of the comparison of the two. And here is, again, this was about several days after the flyby. They came out with this, another region which they've called Sputnik Plano, named after Sputnik, the early satellite that the Russians launched, which scared the Americans so much. They said, we've got to have a space program. But they're showing that what this almost looks like a brain material, isn't it? But you have these troughs and dark material in them.
Or intestines, I don't know.
I know. And pitted surfaces and hills. They're speculating, and over here, these things. I don't know if you see them, but it looks like there's some trails of dark material coming like being blown over here. They think these might be plumes, but again, they're going to be looking very carefully at more photos.
You mean like smoke?
It could be ice geysers. It could be like Triton, the moon of Neptune, actually had ice geysers that Voyager saw when it passed by in 1989. It was spectacular. And that's what they're looking for, some plumes of ejecta, because they know the surface is young, so it might be younger than we even imagine.
What is it's kind of like, is that, I don't know, of the surface material, what would that be?
It could
it's
be
pretty light in color.
Yeah,
so
I know. It could be a lava flow. It probably is
Oh,
lava.
ash.
It's hard to tell. It could be. It's just they're going to have to find out where is that coming from. And that's why they're looking at these kind of objects to see if there's evidence
Maybe
that there's something
lava
coming.
peaks or something.
Yeah. This came out today. So these were ice sheets that they've now come in, and these just came out at 11 o'clock our time. So I stuck them right into the presentation, and what they're thinking is these ice sheets are resurfacing. I mean, they also can be resurfacing this planet, and so they might be moving and receding, just like ice sheets move and move forward and recede on the Earth. This might still be going on and not just be from way long ago.
So they know that it's ice, so that it would be water?
Yes, although it could be nitrogen ice. It could be some other kind of ice. It doesn't necessarily have to be hydrogen, H2O ice.
Some other gases. Or
It could be, because I know they have a lot of nitrogen, especially like in the Neptune system, and this is just farther out than Neptune. Now, just to kind of get over into the astrology part of it, I was just going to mention, on the left side is the best picture that we got of the other side of Pluto, the one we didn't fly by. We flew by the right side, and
dark side of Pluto.
yeah, the one with the heart, the one that charmed everybody. If you look at the bottom, these were distant pictures of Pluto, and you can see the heart, now that you know what to look for. And on the left, you see these dark spots in the bottom, which were very, very strange and interesting, and it was kind of like a shame that we couldn't get a close-up of those dark spots. And above, that is the best, most detailed picture we have of those 4 dark spots. So it's going to be interesting what they decide to come up with about what could be causing them, if it's material that's been oozed out of the surface, or whether it's coming from the moons. Maybe the moons are falling into have material that's flaking off of them onto Pluto. So we'll find that out. But what I was thinking is, one of the things about Pluto for astrologers is it's very powerful. It's what's small that is powerful out of all proportion. That's why the atom bomb is considered a plutonic thing. Gangsters, the rise of gangsterism around when Pluto was discovered was considered a significant correspondence, because you have one guy with a Tommy gun and he's just so much more powerful than anyone else. And Pluto in general, that power, that will, is the will of every individual to want to do something with their lives. But you do have the choice of whether you do good or you go in for very selfish interests. I felt like when we flew by there, for us to have been charmed rather than scared by the encounter gives us a real positive feeling, maybe reminds us that there is a positive power. And it's, when someone's powerful, it's usually because they have money, sex appeal, contacts.
That's a perceived power, though.
Right. But you can use that for good.
Yeah.
And the one thing that happened on Twitter is everybody was taking this image and putting "I heart Earth" or "I heart Pluto." So I think people were really charmed by this loving kind of image that we got when we were flying by. So now this actually was another image that just got released. This was New Horizons looking back after traveling past 1.25 million miles and seeing the sun backlit of the planet. And this is something we see when we see a total eclipse. But it also showed the scientists how thick that atmosphere is on Pluto. This is 4 times farther out into space than they expected the atmosphere to be. So this was a big surprise, and it's a beautiful picture of that they got on their way out of this system. So the second part of what I'm going to tell you about is that Pluto is not alone out there, and this is big news that only is maybe a few decades old, because for a long time after 1930, when we discovered Pluto, everyone felt pretty confident in our telescopes to say, well, there's nothing else out there. But in the 1990s, small rocky bodies like Pluto in that area were starting to come up. And so there were several scientists and astronomers who said, you know, we should just really throw everything we got out there and see if what is out there. Is there anything as big as Pluto? Is there maybe another gas giant like Jupiter or Neptune or something out there? So some of these objects were found by people looking for near-Earth objects, so that, you know, there's a big effort in the last few decades to make sure we don't get hit by a small asteroid that's big enough to really cause trouble. So some of them came up in those surveys, but others were like I mentioned in the last bullet here, found by a Caltech team right here in nearby in Pasadena, led by a Dr. Mike Brown, and his team found 3 rather large objects, one as big as Pluto, and they were announced in 2005 to a big kind of hoopla. And these 3 objects are called Haumea, Makemake, and Eris. Now, there is a body of called the International Astronomical Union who makes names decisions, and they decided that these objects out in this area should be named after creation gods, and so that's why there's these names have come up. Haumea is a childbirth goddess of Hawaii, and Makemake is a bird god, a creation god of the Easter Island people, and Eris is actually they kind of bent the rules a little bit, because this is the one as big as Pluto, and they allowed Dr. Brown to name him Eris after the sister of Mars, the sister of Eris, so a goddess of war. Haumea on the left has 2 moons, Namaka and Hi'iaka, and you can see the moons on the upper and the lower part of that little screen. Not very clear picture, as you can see. Makemake has no moons, and I forgot to mention the orbitals is Pluto is orbiting around 247 years to get around the sun. Haumea is 285 years, so a little farther out. Makemake is 310 years to get around the sun, and Eris, with the 1 moon Dysnomia, which you can see a little bit in that right-hand image, takes 560 years to go around the sun, and it's a very eccentric orbit. So these are these 3 objects, and we're going to talk about them. Even though we can hardly see them, we can find out stuff about these objects. So what we want to do is we want to look to see where they are in the zodiac and how they relate to other solar system members. And this is what professional astrologers do. You know, they look up your birth date when they want to do a reading for you, and they say, not just are you a Sagittarius, you're an Aries, or whatever. They say, well, where is the sun located in Sagittarius? And where are other planets located in relation to that sun of your birth? And so we're going to look at people who have these new dwarf planets in significant spots in the birth charts. And that's how we're going to figure out what these planets might mean. Now, the challenge for me is to show you very quickly, because I'm sure that you might not know all of the little things astrologers do to make their little notes about, oh, I know where this object is and that object is, and when they're meaningful. But I'm going to show you the what we really look at, and give you a little bit of a shorthand, so you'll know what I'm talking about when I say this is meaningful to when it's in this position or it's in that position. But I'm going to do it very simply. We're going to show that there's the angles between the sun or Mercury or Mars. Those are very important when you look at them relating to these new objects. And I use diagrams to show this. And this is the kind of diagrams I'm talking about. It all depends on where these 2 objects are located. Like if you have the sun here, and Pluto is there, and they're in Pisces. You see the little Pisces glyphs, and these are degrees of the zodiac. So they're 6 degrees apart. That's called a conjunction, even though it's not 0 degrees apart. If your birthday is like that, you're probably going to be a pretty powerful individual. There's something about you that's quite significant and it could be overbearing, or it could be charisma. There's opposition is maybe the second most important one, is when the sun is opposite Pluto, or two planets are opposite one another. And then you have a triangle called the trine, which is 120 degrees away. An object here would make it a full triangle. And then the square, and see, we have like a 90 degrees here. And then the sextile. And what we're really doing is we're dividing the circle. We're saying a conjunction is no division. Opposition is dividing the circle in 2, and then we're dividing it in 3, and then 4, and then we go a little bit to 6, because once you start dividing, the divisions of 2 and 3 are really the most powerful divisions. So I tend to find that 5 or 7 or 9, they're a little watered down, and what I want to show you are people who are very potently active in these planets. So I look at criminals, and I look at really famous people, and so it's like you usually see divisions of 2 and 3, and this is like a 3, and this is 8. These are divisions of 8, which is another division of 2. 2, 4, 8. Okay. And the reasons I have these particular numbers is these are actual people. So this is Galileo, the astronomer from the early 17th century, and Martin Luther King and Jackie Chan. All of these people had Pluto in their chart configuring with the sun. George Washington, this is a writer, Hermann Hesse, and Albert Einstein. And to kind of remind you a little bit about their power, Galileo was the first person to actually look through a telescope that was decent enough to see things in the sky. He saw that Venus had phases and actually was orbiting the sun. This is still new stuff that they didn't really like to admit. The sun was in the center of our universe. Martin Luther King, his main focus is to try to help others, to try to help other African Americans. So an opposition for Pluto would make a lot of sense. Jackie Chan, a trine would be more of somebody who has an easy expression of his power. He's an entertainer, and he's an athletic person, and so his power is all in his body, and it's all fun and comedy and stuff like that. And Jeffrey Dahmer, who was a terrible murderer, a mass murderer, has the square, and his power was that he could overpower people, which was he was using it in a very negative way. Einstein was here we go with the 3s are really usually very good or beneficial, whereas the 2s can be troublesome. Even though Martin Luther King did wonderful things for his people, he ended up sacrificing his life, and he went through terrible trials. Einstein, had incredible discoveries, and had honors, won a Nobel Prize. He had his difficulties early on in his life, but ended up, very much considered incredibly famous and well off. Hermann Hesse and George Washington have these similar objects, which means they go through trials. Hermann Hesse was a writer who was very isolated, had trouble dealing with people, but because of that, he used to read a lot and then became a writer and ended up winning the Nobel Prize in Literature. So he kind of made lemonade out of his lemons. Yeah. And George Washington, he was a rich person, but he gave up everything to become the head of the army for the Revolutionary War, and built this country. He could have left after they won the war, but he was dragged back into Washington to serve as president for 8 years. So he went through a lot of things for this country. So the reason I'm picking these people and I'm talking so much about Pluto, even though we somewhat have left Pluto, is because there's something lurking here that we did not know until one of these discoveries was made, and that is that Haumea was also in a conjunction with Pluto at this time, and Haumea has really misled people who felt that Pluto had this dual role of being about power and transformation. And what I've learned is that Haumea is really the transformation element. It's just for the last 450 years, it's been doing a series of conjunctions, like in the late 16th century, when Galileo was born, Haumea was conjunct Pluto. In the other corner, George Washington in the 1730s, Haumea was also conjunct. Pluto and Haumea were doing a tag team as they have been moving around the zodiac, and eventually Pluto is faster, and it ends up making an opposition after a 1400-year period. But in the last roughly 450, 500 years, they have had a number of conjunctions. So Haumea has been this hidden element in astrology that we really haven't known about. And the reason I can tease this apart is, I'll show you. When Einstein was born, you know, he had them conjunct, but when he came up with his special relativity paper, Haumea was conjunct the sun. When Martin Luther King was born, again, he had that opposition that was, even though Haumea and Pluto weren't very close, they were still opposite in range to his sun. But when he gave his I Have a Dream speech during the March on Washington, Haumea was there, it wasn't Pluto. And George Washington, again, he had this double conjunction, but when the Bill of Rights was signed with him as president, it was Haumea that was with the sun at that time. Haumea is great change, great transformation, and you'll see as I show you a few more examples that this must be so. Haumea is ruthless. It will stop at nothing, and when you have people who will do bad things, you see people who will, you know, just be so shockingly ruthless, and you know, these people here, I'm sure you know most of them. Hitler, of course. His chart, when you look at him without dwarf planets, you say, well, how come this guy caused so much trouble? But when you see that Haumea was there, you start to understand that he was really bad news. And Stalin, with his Mars opposite Haumea and Pluto, Osama bin Laden had Haumea, Pluto square his sun, Mars rather. And Muhammad Atta was the leader of the onboard terrorists. He had a Sun Haumea conjunction. I just put this slide in today because yesterday Lafayette, Louisiana had the movie theater shooting, and they just had confirmed earlier this afternoon that the shooter was born on November 2nd, 1955, and he has, just like Stalin and bin Laden, Mars with Pluto Haumea, and right now we have Mars square Haumea. So we have yet another, we really do have an answer to all the media people were saying, how does this happen? Why does this happen? I mean, I can't say why the man did it, but I know why he chose this moment, because it's a time where Haumea people come out of the woodwork, unfortunately, and they just can't help themselves, especially if they're mentally ill, like this man appears to be. Now, you can have Haumea in a difficult aspect, but you can do good things nevertheless. These are the three men who were on the United Flight 93, and they defeated the onboard terrorists, and they ended up crashing the plane and killing everybody, but they stopped it from crashing into the Capitol building or the White House, wherever those terrorists were going. And when I saw this, it really moved me to see that Todd Beamer, Mark Bingham, and Tom Burnett were all Sun Square Haumea. They had the power to change the plans of the hijackers.
It's too much of a coincidence, huh?
That's it. It's like it's
It's also interesting that their last name all starts with B.
I know.
Or T. Two of them have T and B.
Yeah.
too.
I know.
The
It's
last
just,
names are all B, starting with B.
and yeah, and they weren't they definitely had different birth dates, but this is what they have in common, and this is so exciting to share with you. So there, not everything is so terrible and serious with Haumea. People just will change their life completely when they have Haumea in their chart. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was a very bad invalid, a very talented woman, but she had an overbearing father who kept very much control of her. But she met poet Robert Browning and she fell in love, but her father wouldn't let her marry him. She had to leave everything. She had to kind of get out of the house, and they eloped, and she had to leave and never speak to any of her family again. She had about maybe 6 or 7 brothers and sisters that she was very attached to, but she left everything and she completely changed her life and went to Italy. But she gained so much because she got better. She, being in England was really probably bad for her health. She had a loving husband and they had a child. So it was a great change for her. And so the sextile, which is one of those good aspects, is when you see the curves, that's the good thing. When you see the angles, that's the bad thing. Emily Dickinson was a poet, and she was writing around 1850, but she wrote like modern poetry. She wrote very, very unusual poetry, and nobody could understand what she was doing. They said, no, your lines aren't rhyming and you're using punctuation funny. And she just decided, well, no one's going to understand me now, and she took her poems and just made little packets of them and put them away. And by 1950s, she was being celebrated as a genius, but she didn't live to see it. But she was changing what poetry was like. So that was her change. And then M.C. Escher, if you remember all those weird prints where you have stairways that come around and unite somehow, and it gives you a very odd perspective. Escher just transformed that sort of lithography.
The artist?
Yes, graphic art. Or he'd have an arm that was drawing an arm that was drawing an arm. It was very circular and odd. So he was really changing, your perception of reality. And the last one here is Copernicus, who, came up with this theory. I think the sun is in the center, and so he has the trine because he didn't have any trouble with this very radical change because he didn't publish it until he was about to die. Wow. He knew it would be a big stink, Here are just some examples of people who had disastrous changes in their lives. In the top row are the people and their birth charts, their birth diagrams, and on the bottom is the terrible changes that happened. Mark David Chapman is the one who killed John Lennon, and he had Sun Square Haumea and killed Lennon at Sun Square Haumea. Michael Jackson had a conjunction of Pluto Haumea, and he was a very powerful, transformative figure. But one of the worst things that happened to him was when he had this accident while filming a Pepsi Cola.
Oh, the burn.
Yes,
yeah.
when he burned his hair, and that is when his drug problems began. So it was transformed him in a terrible way. Nicole Brown Simpson was a lovely woman. She probably wanted more from life. She wanted to transform her life, and she met this incredibly powerful young football player. She said, he's going to transform my life. Unfortunately, he transformed it by killing her, and it was at Sun Square Haumea. And James Earl Ray is who killed Martin Luther King, and I just used a different technique. There's another thing that astrologers use where they don't look at what's happening in the sky when they're looking at your chart. They look at the same number of years that you're, what your age is, and then look that many days after you were born. So they're looking at that miniature pattern. And if you look at that for James Earl Ray, it's called progression. When you look at progression, that Pisces sun becomes a 0 Taurus sun, and it's then square that Haumea, which is just moves into Leo. You see how it's at 29 degrees of Cancer? It's moved slightly in that other technique that astrologers use. So so that's quite dramatic, and that's the moment he actually shoots Martin Luther King. To get you into the next object, I'm going to show you a time where Haumea was conjunct the next one. And it was in the 1700s. You have these people like Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, who were transformative figures. They built this country. They founded wrote the beginning documents like the Declaration of Independence. Giacomo Casanova was someone who lived in the 1700s, and he was quite a colorful figure, not just a lover, but he was a writer and he was a composer, and he wrote an incredible biography about his life. And Mozart, of course, is the famous composer. All were intellectually transformative, and all of them had Haumea in conjunction, configuring their sun. And their amazing, some of their most amazing achievements came when Makemake was configuring the sun in real time at the time. The Declaration of Independence was written or finally confirmed at sun in the sesquire to Makemake, and one of those divisions of 8. And that would be for both Jefferson and Franklin. They were both in the committee to draft that declaration. Casanova, one of his most key moments was he was a bit of a con man, and they imprisoned him because he had books on magic, and the Inquisition was very prevalent at that time. They put him in prison and they threw away the key. They weren't even going to try him, and he knew he had to get out of there. And it took him a year to figure out an ingenious plan, but he escaped what they called the Leads, the Viennese prison. The Venetian prison. It was in Venice. And he escaped on the day when the sun and Makemake and Haumea were all conjunct. This escape was so elaborate, and he told the story of his escape, which went on for 2 hours. He would tell people, and it was his key to go to all the heads of Europe, and he would get money, he would get favors, because he had this wonderful story about his escape. So that was his Makemake moment, because it was a very, very big surprise. Nobody thought anyone would ever escape from this prison. And Mozart, one of his great symphonies, the number 25, was composed almost within, I think he composed it in just a couple days, and that was at a Makemake time, as you can see in that figure. This intellectual object is for very unusual and shocking and surprising intellect. It's something that's more than just your garden variety smart people. It's people who are almost in a total order of magnitude even more intellectually acute. And when you look at people who are using this for criminals, it just surprises you that they will do certain things. And you must admit that O.J. Simpson was surprising on the football gridiron, and surprising when we find out that suddenly he's somehow involved with his wife's death. Anders Breivik was the Norwegian who killed 77 people all by himself in that Norway massacre. I mean, who would have known that this guy could just do all this himself, and no one knew about it? Charles Manson also was in the 60s, shocked everybody that he had such an intellectual hold over the Manson family. And Bernie Madoff made $1 billion disappear. Nobody ever could have even imagined that somebody could have pulled that off. On the bottom row were just shocking moments of the last few decades, when 3 Mile Island accident, or the Sandy Hook shooting, 9/11. A stunning moment. And when Mount St. Helens, I don't know if you remember, in 1980, everybody knew that was going to erupt, but nobody knew it was going to explode. And so there were all these scientists that were around the volcano, but they thought they were in a safe spot, and many were killed. The people who have Makemake in their chart are so much more incredible. Edison came out, with the light bulb and motion pictures and phonographs. I mean, he was just so wildly talented. Da Vinci was such a surprising intellect. Hawking came up with black holes before we could even imagine that black holes existed. Nikola Tesla was also one of those early pioneers in electricity. And Neil Armstrong, he walked on the moon. I mean, it can't be any more surprising than that. These are some artists, just to give you an idea. I give you more different people in different professions, just so you realize that, you know, there really must be something to this. Salvador Dali, you know, if you're an astrologer, when you're looking for somebody who's a little crazy, you're looking for, where's Uranus in there? And years ago, I kept saying, Salvador Dali doesn't have Uranus in any particular spot that I would consider significant, and yet he's crazy, he's nutty, you know, it's very surreal. Well, it's Makemake that finally answered that question. Mary Shelley, she wrote Frankenstein the Monster, the original book, so who was animated by electricity. So here you can have that shocking thing. J.K. Rowling is Harry Potter's author. Hitchcock, he loved to shock people, as I'm sure you remember some of his scary movies. And Shakespeare, he was such a surprising intellect that people kept saying, and they still say it, oh, I don't think Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. You know, he's just this little teacher out in Stratford on Avon. Why, how could he have done it? I think he did it after I saw Makemake in his birth chart. These are just some events that when Frankenstein was written, Sun was published, Sun conjunct Makemake. Metropolis, on the left, was the first science fiction movie, a silent film. It was just on Turner Classic Movies, so you might have caught it, but it is very bizarre.
I don't know if I've ever seen that.
It's a silent movie, so you might catch it on, well, I think the Sunday night is their silent movie night, but it is so weird. It's really way before its time, which is another phrase you could hear when you hear of Makemake people. Rite of Spring was a ballet that was so dissonant and so different that the audience rioted when it debuted on a day where Sun was very conjunct Makemake. 8 degrees I meant for both of those. That's why I only put the one degree. And Psycho debuted with Sun in a semi-square to Makemake. So it's quite a potent image. Now, I said before the Declaration of Independence was written at Sun Makemake, a moment, which was, think of how we celebrate the 4th of July. Fireworks! Very much, you know, scares all our dogs anyway. So many of our presidents have Makemake in their chart. JFK was born at Sun conjunct Makemake and died at Sun trine Makemake. Nixon had a Makemake in his chart, and he resigned very shockingly. Everybody was, knew he was in trouble, but did anyone expect him to resign way back in 1974? George H.W. Bush had the conjunction, and his son had the conjunction. You can see on the bottom. I have it like he produced George W. Bush. Family resemblance. Obama has Sun conjunct Makemake, and he ordered bin Laden to be killed at Sun square Makemake. And again, Washington, not only did he have Haumea and Pluto, Makemake was there. It was a triple conjunction for Washington. He was quite an incredible person. And we now know how incredible because of these new planets. Our last one is as big as Pluto, and in some ways I think that it is a twin to Pluto, and so the meaning of Pluto can help us start on a meaning for Eris. With Pluto, here I'm trying to explain that astrologers always look at planets in pairs. You know, like sun and moon, you know, is daytime and nighttime in some ways, and Mars and Venus, men and women. Well, when astrologers look at the outer solar system and they see, say, Jupiter and Saturn, they say, well, that's excess and limits, right? Limitations. Thank you. And Uranus and Neptune is the individual and the collective. So here we have Pluto, which is will and power. Eris must be the antidote to that. And that's actually something that we really need when we have so many terrorists running around and we don't know how to handle them. All this chaotic, all this ISIS thing going on, where people are just saying, I want to do these things because I'm power, I have these weapons and so forth. Maybe Eris can give us an idea what might be the antidote to this kind of energy that's out there. So I think that Eris may be the sort of like a collective, but the cohesive collective of others that can stand up to Pluto's willfulness. And so Eris in some ways is like the other, the alien, the outcast, people we don't understand, and in a wider sense, everyone else. If that's true, then someone who has a negative Eris is probably antisocial. And so I had collected a lot of instances where Eris is present, where people are treated very badly as a group. Like Kristallnacht was a time when all the Jews were being rounded up, and some were killed, others were put in concentration camps in 1938, and it was just because they were Jewish. It wasn't because of a personal thing. Jonestown, when all those people were made to commit suicide, Jim Jones didn't care about them as persons. He said these are his followers and we're all going to commit suicide. And so as a group, they were just done away with by him. In the Chattanooga Church Massacre, Dylan Roof said, I'm going to kill black people. He didn't care who they were. It was just he thought that this was going to be starting a race war.
But this one has a curved...
Yes, and actually I'm going to come back to that because that's a very interesting thing. All the ones are kind of negative because a conjunction can be pretty negative with the difficult things there. The Norway Massacre, again, we were talking about Breivik, who he was trying to start a race war as well. He didn't like the Islamists that had come to Norway. And the Boston Marathon bombing, the Tsarnaev brothers were doing it because they didn't like what Americans were doing, and they didn't think they were helping the Chechens. So on the bottom you have people that perpetrated these, and they have negative Eris, not with the Sun, Mars, or Mercury. But like you said, Sylvia, Chattanooga Church Massacre, that sextile is unusual. But what I found most interesting about it is he didn't succeed in starting his race war. In fact, the families came to his, when he was in court for that first appearance, and they forgave him because he didn't realize that he was trying to break people who were so committed to their church and to Jesus and to each other. And the survivors are saying, my family member, I'm heartbroken, but I must forgive you because that's what we believe in. So the sextile says that something good was happening, and a lot of things have been happening, like they have finally taken down the Confederate flag in the Capitol, which was really breaking the hearts of so many people that would continue up so many years after that war was finished. So it's an interesting thought that those people that died were good people with Eris. And if you look at people who do have positive Eris, for the most part, now we have some difficult ones here, but Jackie Robinson, who broke the color barrier, his difficulty was he had to be cursed and spit on and called all sorts of names, but he did succeed at being the first black person in Major League Baseball, and that allowed other people to then become hired into Major League Baseball. But Mandela, he had difficulties because he was in prison for decades, and yet when he came out, he became president of a anti-apartheid-free South Africa, and so he had incredible success in his life. And Pope John Paul was someone who was instrumental in helping get the fall of communism. He worked very hard to help the Polish people who were pushing back against Russia back in the 80s. And Obama, for someone who is an African American to become the president, he had to be very likable and like people, and so he's got a positive Eris. Malala is the young girl who was shot by the Taliban and almost killed. Malala Yousafzai, and yet she lived and moved to England and has recovered and won the Nobel Peace Prize, and is now still working for young girls everywhere to be able to have education and not be intimidated by the Taliban and others. Eris is in the USA chart, and when I was talking to you about that progression where you go a day for a year to see how things are unfolding in a chart, kind of a miniature way of looking at astrology, we have the opposition when we founded this country, and it's very apt because we knew, the founders knew that slavery was going to be problematic, but they couldn't get rid of it at the time because the southern states wouldn't go along with the drive for independence. But when that sun moved around 90 years later, that's when the Civil War began, and that's when the sun started to square that Eris in that progression configuration. And that was the beginning of trying to solve that problem. Then as that kept going, almost 100 years later, is when the Civil Rights era began with Rosa Parks on the bus and being arrested, and then the bus boycott and everything, and Martin Luther King marches and so on. Today we are experiencing, 60 years later of course, the sextile of that Sun Eris figure. And it's, well, I'll get to what I think that is going on now, because things are certainly not perfect, but we are making progress. But I wanted to just point out that in 30 years we will have the square again. So it would be interesting to see what in 2045, what people we are trying to assimilate, or, you know, who knows, maybe we will be getting that message from, like in Contact, to know that there are even other aliens, other out people that we don't understand, and we're going to have to try to understand them. These were just some events that also had Eris in that were related to the ones that we just looked at. Like for the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation was effective at Sun sextile Eris, and the bus boycott was a trine. So the Civil Rights Act was a square, and the Martin Luther King's assassination came at a conjunction of Eris. So I think Eris really is something about our dealings with other people and trying to understand people who are just not familiar to us. And now here we are today with the sextile. We have just, the Supreme Court has just said that states cannot ban gay marriage. Gay people have been others for a long time. I remember when I was in college, I had I knew people who were gay, and they really couldn't talk to their parents about it, and they were a little, you know, they didn't know if they should tell people that they're gay, and it was a big deal. And, you know, when I was young then, I just thought that's the way it always had to be, because I didn't, you know, that's the way it seemed to be. And as time has gone on, there's been a lot of pushback on that. And now, here it comes where the Supreme Court has made this decision, and yet I have to say that knowing that our country seems to be saying, we have this principle that everybody should be created equal and are allowed to pursue their own happiness. If that's really true, we really do have to extend it out more and more to people who haven't felt enfranchised in society. And I thought it was incredible that on the day of that decision, Venus, the planet, which is, you see that underneath the 18, Venus is the planet of marriage, was trine Eris down there under the 23. And then you also have the great change that is with the Haumea under the 20 on the other sextile. That's a very beautiful figure. And with Jupiter there next to Venus, it's an expansion of our idea of marriage. And a lot of people are going to have trouble with it. I know my own mother is really having a lot of difficulty dealing with that. She's a charismatic Christian. But I mean, in my heart, I know that this is a good thing. And when I see a figure like that, I say, I do know that it's something that we needed to do. That's all I'm going to be talking about these new objects, Haumea, Eris, and Makemake. There are other objects which I deal with in my book, More Plutos, which is being sold here at the Dharma Center Bookstore. Sedna is one that's really interesting, especially if you have problems with isolation or obsession or have suffering in some fashion. It's a very important object because it's got a 12,000-year orbit, 11,500 year orbit, and it's very slow. That gives it its weight, really, I think. And it's been speeding up. It's actually coming in for a close approach to the sun in the next 80 years. It's been like almost a star in its fixed nature for hundreds of years previous. So it's an interesting object that you might want to learn about. And then there are these other objects, Quawar Varuna, which are around Haumea in that particular part of the Kuiper Belt, Orcus and Ixion, which are near Pluto, and these two unnamed objects are near Makemake and Eris. And someday, hopefully, the discoverers will name them. But I have nicknames for some of them in the book. But just as you've seen here, I use celebrities and events and historical figures in my book. I do have some of these little notations, but it's nothing you can't just ignore. It's kind of like for astrologers to show them I've done my homework. But everyone has little bios, kind of like I was giving to you tonight, so you don't have to go look up on Google who these people are. I give you all you need to know about their history and why they are why are they related to these dwarf planets. But this is going to be, I really believe this will be a big change for astrology, and it's going to be interesting for us to know about them because these objects are in this chaotic region of our solar system, and they talk about things that are disturbing to the status quo, and we're going to learn more about them, and I think that's going to help society in the long run. So, any questions that anyone has?
How do we figure out